Well, good morning, good afternoon. We will start here in just a moment, discussing speak to be heard, not to talk. Since it is about that time, hopefully we have people that have already and more. Lisa, we're an organization that provides lessons learned based on experience with regards to talent management, leadership, and organizational development. If you like us, please share. If you're listening in and you like the content, please share on your social media outlet. And also, please, if you have comments or questions, put them in the chat function. We will try to address any questions that are brought up during this podcast. So I'd like to kick off our discussion with regards to Speak to be Heard by introducing our panelists. First, we have Mr. Dan Bradley. Dan is a 2015 USAFA grad, and as a 2000 West Point grad, I'd like to say great game this last weekend.
Agreed.
Go Army. He is a former Air Force Special Warfare officer, and he is currently the Director of Sales at Con Mechanical Contractors. So really, really glad to have Dan in the discussion. We also have Dr. Chris Frueh. He is a professor of psychology at the University of Hawaii. And I'm not sure how he does this, but he is also a performance specialist at Grey Goose Solutions. Grey Ghost. Sorry, I have holiday beverages on my mind already. Grey Ghost Solutions out of Houston. Great to have you, Chris. And of course, we also have Michelle, who is on the EF Overwatch marketing team. And she will be closing out our panel discussion with the top 3 lessons learned. And from what I've heard from some of the previous podcasts, that is the most important minute of the show. So please stick around to hear that. So I would like to introduce our topic today. And if you see me fumbling over here, I've got a bunch of notes because every time I talk to these gentlemen, I end up taking more notes than I actually started with, meaning I got more out of it than maybe I necessarily put into it. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. But the idea today is talking about speaking to be heard and not necessarily speaking to talk. And what I mean by that is we often say things, self-expression, we're putting stuff out there, but we're not necessarily focused on how the message is received. As a leader, and especially as someone who wants to manage talented personnel in the future, it is extremely important that the message you put out there is actually the one that's received, which means you have a sender and a receiver, and they need to hear what you think you want them to do. And the best way I can describe this is by using an example. And I'm going to use a very simple example. And it's, hey, honey, can you get the dishes done? At home, I don't know how many times, whether you're married, whether this is with your parents, whether that's with children, friends, you ask them to do something. Hey, can you get the dishes done? Is my example. And my husband says, yeah, sure. Well, an hour later, our friends are walking through the front door, the dishes aren't done, and I'm mad at my husband. Well, he's going to get the dishes done. He received the message I sent, but he didn't receive the message I thought I was sending, which is, please get the dishes done before our friends come over for dinner. And that's something we need to look at as leaders. And let me take this into the business world. I've worked at multiple engineering firms. Specifically, I've worked at Shell Oil. And one of the things that's really critical when you are a project manager is communication with clients. And I've contacted a client previously and said, hey, listen, I need you to call me back. I need information from you. This is priority information that I need. And I will get maybe a text message back, maybe an email. Well, that's not what I needed. I needed a phone conversation to have a discussion about the work so that we could move forward on a project. And I needed it as soon as physically possible. So there's a great book, and in a lot of these conversations, I reference books, but it's called Crucial Conversations, and it's written by Carrie Patterson. What I really liked about the book is that it focused on what is your desired conversational end state. That's the first question to ask when you're communicating. And is it winning, or is it getting to a certain goal? So I'm going to use one other personal example before I hand it off to Chris and Dan and find out what their opinions are on the topic, or kind of listen to their first 2 cents. Which another example is, my husband loves to travel for hunting trips. Sometimes I like to go see things. So if I'm going to present a vacation idea, I want to sit there and make sure somehow he believes that the same location is going to be beneficial for him. So I present it starting with what he wants to get out of a vacation. Hey, baby, if we go to X location, you can hunt X, Y, and Z. And then I'll follow it up with what I want to do at that location. But I present it in a way that he can receive it, and maybe receive it the way I want to, so we get the desired end state versus an argument of where we want to go. Of course, there are a whole lot of business applications to this, but before we get too deep into how we do this in the business world, I'd like to hear from Dan. What are your thoughts?
You know, Lisa, thanks for that. I couldn't agree more that can you do the dishes example hits a little bit too close to home. But you know, the vast majority of the issues that I've encountered, whether it's in my personal life, in private industry, or even in the military, the root cause of the issue can almost always be traced back to communication, or more specifically, failure to communicate. Did the conversation take place? Yeah, more often than not. But the communication isn't always effective. And you know, you brought up a great point of what is the end state of this conversation? What am I actually trying to achieve out of this discussion? And if you're not ensuring that the intent of your communication was understood, then you may as well not have communicated at all. You know, I'm a big quote guy. I understand that not everybody is, but Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw, just going to pull from his knowledge and his background. The single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. I'm not even sure there's any more to tag on to that. It's just always a false assumption to believe that the person you're communicating with, the receiver, whether it's an individual or a group, actually heard what you meant, even if they heard what you said. So, you know, Chris, I'll hand it off to you. What are your thoughts?
I'm going to borrow from physics and engineering, since Lisa's an engineer, just to remind all of us that we have, when we're communicating, we have a signal to noise problem. Signal to noise is a phrase from physics and engineering that can actually be expressed in the form of an equation involving decibels. That's not exactly the problem we as humans typically have, but the signal to noise problem is very real. So when we're speaking, we have to be mindful of all the other pieces of noise that are coming between ourselves and the receiver. And let me just pause there. I see we have a really good question from our listening audience. So let me turn it over to Lisa at this point. So maybe I'll just keep going here. So Lisa's a little technical difficulties here. Oh,
yeah,
she's
sorry
back.
about that. Please, yes, please. I saw it is a very good question. Ryan asked, with regards to COVID communication, that interpersonal connection through body language, sometimes through tone, is definitely lost right now. And to double tap here. The question is Ronald Culpepper recommendations on communication in COVID crisis at times. And you couldn't be more correct, Ron. There are a lot of business problems that are occurring because of the lack of being able to see the person you're talking to. And as we go more into the digital world, we were trying to solve that with things like this, like visual, whether it's conversations via Teams or Zoom. The problem is everybody's getting the Zoom fatigue, they're getting the Teams fatigue, or you can't share a document and see the person at the same time. In first reaction, how do we connect with this virtual world? I would say one, of course, is the feedback loop. And Dan already started kind of talking about it a little bit, but to have somebody come back and tell you what you told them is critical. But another aspect of that is having a relationship outside of work discussions with your coworkers. We need now more than ever to bond as people. And as much as that sounds like a soft skill, I know that there is one person I work with as an Army reservist. I have a captain that I work with on brigade staff who is absolutely fantastic at their job, but they are dry and stoic and not real good at the mushy. And so I know if I ask that person a question, I'm going to get, in accordance with regulation X, Y, and Z, line item X, Y, and Z, you should be doing this. In their point of view, they are being sued by giving me the regulation and line number. So because I know them, I take no offense to that. Now, if the same person would ask me the same question, so roles reversed, and that's all, would know that I am either in a hurry or in a bad mood, because chances are I would start off with, hey, how is your holiday break going? Really want to help you out here. This is where I think you could get your best reference, but there's also some people or places you could reference. So knowing somebody on a personal level also helps with that communication. Gentlemen, why don't which one of you? This one.
Yeah, Lisa, happy to step in. And it's such a timely question. We're sitting here on what's basically a glorified Zoom call, right? And we're talking about how important communication is, knowing that we're facing some technical difficulties, knowing that we've got some people who are talking while they're muted, and that's all part of something that we've become way too familiar with lately. Part of that is due to COVID, and I've always believed that COVID has kind of launched us into the future. This is a point that most businesses were going to get to, but that doesn't mean it's healthy for the human condition. And communication is, even if you're communicating from a business perspective, it is about the human condition. It's about knowing who your receiver is. It's about knowing who your audience is. And if you can't communicate effectively to those individuals, then you're not communicating at all. So love what Lisa just said, just in terms of being able to cut through that outside noise. And part of doing that is acknowledging that communication is an art. It's not a science. There's no formulaic approach that you can repeat 10 times out of 10 and make sure you're communicating to the right people every single time. You have to understand what the situation dictates and what the receiver requires. To know what the receiver requires, you have to know them on a personal level. So you have to have those connections built. It's really tough during COVID to continue to build personal relationships. There's a limitation on how many places you can go, when you can go there. From a sales perspective, my role right now is director of sales, and it's really hard to go out and build relationships, especially with general contractors or subcontractors or independent clients, because we can't get with them. We can't go have that meal. We can't go golfing. We can't do those things just because of the restrictions on us. So I would hate to answer your question with a question. but how creative are you willing to be to break through those barriers? It does take a lot of creativity. So Chris, I'll hand this off to you.
Well, I think the Zoom call, the COVID Zoom call, is a phenomenon we're all going to remember years from now. We'll be talking to the people that are just now being born about the year 2020 when we communicated through Zoom calls mostly. And so I just finished a semester at the University of Hawaii teaching every single one of my classes online through Zoom, where I'm looking at a panel of panels. 20, I can see, I think 20 faces at a time, or maybe it's 30 faces at a time, and then there's more in the next panel. One of the things that I've seen, and I guess I'll link this back to where I started with the signal to noise problem, is you want to make sure that your audience is actually paying attention. And one of the things that we know from the field of cognitive neuroscience is if you're not paying attention, every other cognitive faculty downstream from that really isn't relevant anymore if you're not paying attention. So you have to have the attention of your audience for them even to be able to receive what you're saying. And so sometimes that means cutting through the noise to distract their attention back to you, or to revert their attention back to you. Some of the things that I see in Zoom meetings with my students are, you can obviously see when they're having a sidebar conversation. You see their lips moving, but they're not talking to you. You see them smiling when you're talking about something that's really not funny. Sometimes you see them turning around and talking to people, who are not in the picture, off to the side, or even, on the other side of the computer screen. So you don't even necessarily know, as the speaker, who else is in the room? Who else is in the room hearing what you might be saying? So I think, to be mindful of all of that, and one of the things that I do in my Zoom meetings, if I see somebody's lips moving, I ask them. I know they're not talking to me, but I'll ask them, hey, can you speak up? I can't hear you. You might have to mute your phone to get through. And usually that's one way of refocusing attention. But I think we also have to be compassionate and realize none of us are perfect on Zoom. And so working with our audience to maintain their attention is just a really important thing. I want to now kind of switch a little bit away from the discussion of Zoom calls per se, and again, linking this to the signal to noise problem. I think a really important aspect of a leader's communication is their mindset and their own level of awareness. And I've seen this in my career, and I already know each of you have too. One of the things that leaders often do is they get up and they talk just to be talking. And you as the listener are sitting there oftentimes rolling your eyeballs and going, why are we having to listen to this? I've got real work I could be doing. This is not important. And if they then get to something important, you as the listener may have already tuned out. So I like to say, and I'll probably come back to this in our final wrap-up lightning rounds, I think the mindset of the speaker is really critical. And when you go to communicate, whether it's verbal, whether it's a written communication in an email or an announcement, ask yourself, are you talking to communicate? Do you have a point to make? Or are you just showing off? Are you just talking to let other people know that you're the boss or that you're the leader, that you have all kinds of great things to think about and to talk about? Because if you're doing that, you're not going to be heard. You're not going to get a message through. Sometimes leaders communicate for neither of those two reasons. They may be communicating really as a CYA kind of maneuver. They're making an announcement so that later on they can check a box, or they can say, yes, I communicated that, or yes, we did that step in our process, without there necessarily being an intention of being heard. So I think as a speaker, ask yourself, are you talking to show off? Are you talking to cover your CYA? Or are you talking because you have an important message that you're trying to convey? And if it's the latter, if you have the important message that you're trying to convey, I think it's really important to be able to put that into one sentence. And to say that one sentence, or to make that one point clear, And then you can talk. Then you can show off a little bit if that's what you need. But make your 1 point or your 2 points and then come back to them. And then engage your audience to make sure that they received it and understood it as you want them to. All right, let me see.
Those are some great points, Chris. I'm holding my fingers up because I have two things I want to follow up on that. And one's going to be a question for you, Chris, and Dan, with regards to how, as an employee towards your boss, if your boss is rambling on and you have a bunch of deliverables, how can you communicate effectively with them that you're busy or you're trying to get work to them? So I'm going to ask you both that. But first, I want to address another point that Chris was talking about with regards to, can you communicate in a sentence? Can you clearly get your point across in a short amount of time? And one thing, again, working with engineers, I often have to fight is having the engineering managers go through and do kind of a subject analysis within the body of an email. We all do it, but engineers are very, very good at over-explaining a problem or a solution to an audience that isn't necessarily interested. If a city mayor is asking for a solution on how to repair their streets, they don't really care about the difference between this repair method or that repair method. They care about how long it will take, how much it will cost, and a few other data points, but not necessarily the technical aspects of it. So I talked to my engineer managers about, first and foremost, understand your audience and what do they care about. And then two, can you put your thoughts in bullet points? Now, if underneath the bullet points, in the Army, we call it a bluff, bottom line up front. But in the civilian world, obviously, it's just bullet points. And can you put your thought process in bullet points? And then from there, you can elaborate as required. But yeah, can you chunk it out into very simple, concise statements? Okay, so with that said, I'd like to go back to my question for the other two leaders on this call, Chris and Dan, and that is, as someone who's dealing with a manager who might be a little long-winded, as myself, I know I am, how do you politely communicate with them that, hey, this is not really a good use of my time? Dan?
Yeah, Lisa, absolutely. That's a huge challenge, and it's not specific to any industry. It's just something that we as humans do. We feel that when we're trying to communicate something that is especially important to us, we just continue to emphasize, we elongate that process, and all that's really doing is bringing more noise, and that's exactly the opposite of what we're trying to achieve. So I would say refine the message and receive a readback. So the first step is just making sure that your message is as succinct as it can possibly be. That takes a lot of refining. You know, as someone who enjoys writing, which is just another method of communication or another means of it, I find myself typing away all day long, and then I end up with a 3,000 word document when my target was like 500 to 1,000 words. That is a huge problem because it's really difficult to go back and pull out things that are maybe not important, not succinct, because you just wrote it. It's your baby, right? So it's hard to go back and edit, but refining your message to make sure that you're delivering on what the receiver needs to hear, what they actually truly need to understand, is important. After you've delivered that message, it's, to me, the concept of a readback. A readback is a pretty common term from the community I come from. As an Air Force JTAC, our primary responsibility is communicating lots of important information from the guys on the ground who are requesting close air support to the pilot in the sky who can deliver that weapon. When we pass the targeting information, it's done very succinctly, and it's done in a format that is agreed upon and familiar to both the pilot and the JTAC on the ground. But just because we have a succinct message that's passed quickly and in a repeatable way doesn't mean we don't have to still get a readback. It's not just a nicety. It's not something we do for fun. It is a requirement that we get a readback for every piece of information that we just sent to the pilot to make sure that what was said was actually received. It's, like I said before, never, a safe assumption to believe that they understood what you said, whether it's at the base level of what you actually said, the words coming out of your mouth, or at the deeper level of actually understanding the intent of the message. So the pilot has to repeat that information, all that targeting information, back to the JTAC on the ground, and then I have to look at them. Look at them in the eye. I can't do that, but I have to confirm with them that that was a good readback. You got all the information correct. Now we're ready to move forward. If I don't have a good readback, hey, take a step back. I didn't communicate well. It's not your fault for not receiving well. I fouled up on that. Now let's try this again. Let's clarify that information. Taking that from the military perspective to the business perspective is just as easy to get a readback, except you can actually do what I was saying. You can look someone in the eye. You can say, hey, no kidding, what did you just hear me say? You can feel that you communicated as effectively as you want, and everybody feels they're a good communicator. It's just very rarely the case, and I'm guilty of it just as much as anybody else. But looking directly in the eye of the person or the people that you're trying to communicate with and saying, tell me what you just heard. I need to understand that you heard what I said. And if they didn't, it's not their fault. It's the communicator's fault for not communicating on a level that they needed to hear that information as the receiver. I hope I didn't beat that too much to death, but readbacks are very important. But if you're going to get a readback, you have to cut through the noise first. Got to refine that message. Chris, what you got?
Well, I love the concept of I love the phenomenon of the readbacks. I've never used that term until the last few years, but I think that's exactly what you want when you're communicating, and you want to make sure if it's a specific step that you're asking somebody to take, that you need that readback. And one of the things that you talked about here was also, it's not just about what they say, but can you determine a little bit, what can you discern from their body language, from their tone of voice? Do they sound confident in what they're saying, or are they hesitant, reluctant? I also think, to be mindful of your past history with the individual you're communicating with. What is their history with you in terms of communication? So I think factoring that into the whole discussion is really important. I want to go off on a little bit of a tangent related to readbacks, and there's a kind of the flip side of this in psychology is known as active listening. So here we're talking about, I think the perspective today is speak to be heard. So we're talking about how to help the speaker be more effective. But I think one of the things that leaders can do is they can encourage active listening in the people around them, in larger staff meetings and such. The concept of active listening sounds very simple, and it's kind of the opposite side of the readback. It's, if I'm active listening to what Dan's been talking about, I need to be able to paraphrase it back to him. He tells me something, I paraphrase it back to him, and then I go right from that into making sure that I'm understanding and seeing things from his perspective. Now, this sounds easy. It's actually really, really difficult, and famously difficult. Doctoral programs in clinical and counseling psychology, social work, they put a lot of effort into teaching people who are preparing to become therapists how to do the active listening. And it's more tricky than you think. One of the exercises I do in one of my upper division classes with undergraduate students is I do an exercise where I ask them, pair up and practice talking to each other using active listening. And this is after we've watched some video of it, after we've talked about it, after we've defined it, hopefully after they've read about it. And I mingle around the room as they're doing this. I mix around and I hear the conversations. And for the most part, they're terrible at it. And I'm not criticizing them. We're all pretty much terrible at it unless we're really making a specific effort at active listening, and unless we've already have some understanding of what it is. And in my class exercise, when we kind of reconvene the whole class together and we discuss it as a class, what's often amazing is how everybody says, wow, that was so much harder than I expected it was going to be. Okay, so now we have a question from Cliff Ryan. How can a person, and this is a really good question, and it fits in right, it just slots very naturally right in here. Since we're talking about the receiver's approach now a little bit. How can a person in the lower ranks with a strategic plan to fix major problems in the department be heard at the top of the chain of command when the company's cultural makeup is to stay in your lane? And I don't, I'm gonna let Dan talk about this in just a moment, but I guess I'll say one of the things that I typically do, I go into my meetings with my bosses, usually with an agenda, a list, and I try to keep it to 3 things on my list. And I'll come back and say a little bit more about that, but let me let Dan speak on this right now. Dan, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Chris. And you and I are on the same wavelength with that, because the first thing I wrote down is make sure that you clarify your message. If you go in there and you've got a million problems and you're just trying to tell your boss everything's wrong, everything's jacked up, and there's no light at the end of the tunnel, they're going to tune you out. You just became white noise. So make sure that your message is really clear, really simple, and honestly really short. You know that everyone's got more priorities, and it's very rare to be someone's priority at any given time. So understand that you're intruding on their schedule to some extent. Even if they say they have an open door policy, clarify that message, make it succinct. Number 2, in terms of staying in your lane, know your chain of command. And that's a military term, but it applies everywhere. There's a pecking order, if you want to call it that. You know who you report to, and you know who reports to you. If you don't know that, then you haven't accomplished the first step of being a part of an organization. So understand that chain of command and know where you can communicate and where it's appropriate for you to raise those issues. Number 3, if you're not getting through to somebody on a medium that you typically rely on, switch up your medium, switch up the format and the channel that you're communicating to that person through. If you're trying to hit them up through email, especially in this digital world like we've been talking about, and you're not getting the kind of response or the traction you're looking for, it could be as simple as a text. It could be as simple as a phone call. If you have an opportunity to go face-to-face, always default to going face-to-face. But if you're not getting the traction you're looking for, go through a different medium. And most of all, just be resilient with it and continue to hammer the issue. If it's important to you and you bring it up 1 or 2 times and then you stop, the receiver is going to assume that it stopped being important to you and stopped being important to the company. So they're not going to address it. Just continue to hammer the message home. There is a fine line between, being constructive with that and being a pain, or just becoming another impediment in and of yourself. So that's something to be cautious about, but have some tenacity to it. If you prove that it's important to you, they're going to believe it's important to them.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate those thoughts. Real quick, Thomas Goodwin actually wrote on there, hey, is note-taking effective as an active listening method? Asking for a friend. Love it. So here's an interesting thing that I ended up having to tell everyone I work with. I wouldn't say I have ADHD by definition, but if I am sitting there and just looking at you and not doing something with my hands, I am working on my grocery list. I'm thinking about my workout later today. I am doing anything but being in the moment. I have to be active somehow. So an interesting question of, is note-taking active listening? Yes, but sometimes doodling is active listening as well. And I had the pleasure of taking a communications course where the instructors handed out little stress balls and those pipe cleaners, and everyone at every table, literally every single person, was playing with whatever they found on their desk. And the teacher said, I know exactly how each of you listen effectively based on the first 5 minutes of this class. And it was really, really neat. So note-taking, yes. Doodling, potentially. So especially in a work environment in the business world, you should be working close enough with your coworkers, even if it's virtually. You should know them personally enough to understand how they best receive messages. And that means that they might be like me. They might be actively engaged in something else to be able to listen to a lecture. So I'd like to throw that out there. There was also another question that was brought up, or another comment that was brought up that I really enjoyed, and that I'm probably going to throw over to Chris just because he seems to be really good at these things, and that's dealing with masks. So we talked earlier about communication via Zoom, and having people being a little distracted, working from home. But how do we communicate completely missing those? We're still face to face and we're missing those visual cues. I mean, I love the saying, smile with your eyes, but let's be honest, I can't tell if the eyes are smiling or not. And Chris, based on your experience and your background, do you have anything you can add to that? How to deal with the visual barriers that we have even when we are in person?
Well, I'm not an expert in that. I'm not sure anybody truly is. I think a lot of that is instinct. I like to look at the hands, and I like to look at the shoulders and the posture. Is the person I'm speaking to standing up straight, or are they kind of hunched? What are they doing with their hands? Are they looking at their hands? Are they moving their fingers around, rubbing them? I think those can give you a little clues as to somebody's level of confidence, maybe their state of mind. If you're talking to somebody and they seem anxious, seem nervous, then I think it's a reasonable thing to kind of check that out in most situations. If you have a relationship with the person, that's a good time to just maybe even interrupt yourself, ask for a readback. Hey, are you hearing me here? Or what are you getting out of this so far? Lisa, probably you and I we agreed on a lot of things. I'm not a note taker and I'm not a doodler. I find I listen best if I'm just making eye contact and kind of locked in. That said, I do like to keep a pencil and paper handy. And typically what I try to do when I'm listening is I try to come away with one, two, or three key points that I've written in sort of bullet format. So if you look at my notes at the end of something, people often go, well, you didn't take any notes. And maybe I'll have 3 lines. But each line is something really critical, and I think we're going to get a chance at in the wrap up here to see how Michelle is doing this, because she's going to give us. She's our listener today. She's our most direct feedback member of the audience today. She's going to tell us all what we just said. So fortunately, she's really good at it. All right. Are we ready for final rounds, or Lisa, do you have time for me to ask you one question? Do we have 2 minutes for that? I want to put you on the spot here. You have this brilliant, nifty model, and I don't think we've really shown it to our listening audience here today, and I don't know how well it translates, but I'm just going to put it up here. Lisa sent this out on social media, and I wonder if you could just say a few words about this model and just enlighten us. Give us a 2-minute briefing on it.
Yes, of course. So for those of you who had to take communications classes, whether it be in college or in your corporate life, like I did, it's called the sender-receiver model. So you can Google it if you have to. You get 100 different versions. The one I posted on social media, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram, is the one that Dr. Frueh just showed. And what I really like about it is it's very simple. So you have your sender and you have your receiver. Notice I have my pen as well. Your sender and your receiver. And then it turns out the sender is coding the message. And I love, for anybody who has a military background, using the military radio systems, because the radios automatically do that. They code it and then they decode it at the receiving end. But for those of you not familiar with it, I code a message based on my experiences, and you decode the message based on your experiences. So I'm a small town Christian girl from Plymouth, Wisconsin. And if you're a big New York City type, when I say, hey, I lost my pen at the Bruder House, you have no idea what a Bruder House is, and you never will. You can't Google it. It's a slang term. It's has to do with raising chickens. So that message might have been sent. I could send it all day, but it's not going to be received. So that's the coding and decoding part. But then you have some sort of medium that's in the middle. So not only am I sending a message, but I'm sending it through something, whether it's face-to-face. And as good as face-to-face communications, you can read body language. You also have people who have no body language. So if during those face-to-face communications, you have one person who's super animated, like myself, and you have someone who's very disciplined in their movements, there can be something lost there. And of course, Zoom, and as we experienced on this call alone, connectivity issues, email a lot is lost. The phone even a lot can get lost in that message medium. You have all of that, and that's what's straight across from sender and receiver in Chris's diagram. But then you also have the noise. And Chris has talked about it. Dan went into it a little bit deeper, talking about whatever else is popping up. So a viewer mentioned there's Christmas music playing in the background at his house. There's 2 dogs, there's the kids, the grandparents have come to visit, and he's still trying to get work done in this environment. That is actual noise, but there's other noise. Did you have a fight with someone this morning on your way to work? Did somebody cut you off? Does your car need gas? Did you forget to buy milk at the grocery store? All of that noise is still going on in both the sender and the receiver's lives. And hey, I've got 5 minutes for the 15 minutes of work, or I have 15 minutes of work, but I have to be able to stretch it out into an hour because that's how this works, because I work hourly. There's a bunch of stuff that goes on that creates that noise. And all of that needs to be understood before a person can effectively communicate any message. And along with that, then comes back the readback, or the feedback is what it's called in the sender receiver model that Dan talked about quite extensively, which I'm glad he did, because it's mentioned in almost all of the Echelon Front publications. It's in Extreme Ownership and talked about a lot in that book as well, but you cannot get away from that readback or feedback loop. So hopefully I explained it thoroughly enough to either make you interested or bored enough to doodle. What I'd like to do right now is I'd like to go first to Dan and then to Chris and do what we call within the Talent War Group, the saved rounds session. And that's anything that's kind of bugging us that we want to express in this podcast. Now's our chance to do it. So Dan, what's your saved rounds?
Real simple, and I hate to reiterate it because you and Chris both did an outstanding job talking about it. But what it comes down to is you can communicate well all day long, and it's a really tough skill to get. But when you're done communicating, you have to listen. You have to listen actively, not passively. So when you deliver a message to somebody, you're now in receive mode. The roles have swapped. And you need to behave towards the new deliverer, knowing that you're the new receiver, and give them the same kind of respect and attention that you would expect them to give you, whether they actually gave that to you or not. So that means not thinking about what your response is going to be to their message, not thinking about how you're going to prove them wrong or further iterate your point. You have to make your first priority making sure that you heard what they said. And sometimes in conversations that can lead to pauses. And I think it's just a sign of the times and who we are as humans that we're uncomfortable by silence. That's actually a sales tactic, is silence is uncomfortable. So understand that a pause in a conversation isn't awkward. It means, it can mean any number of things, but usually it either means the conversation is over, and that's a good thing, as long as you've made sure that your message was received. But what it really means is the conversation was healthy. If you're delivering a message to me and I'm not cutting you off and I'm not waiting for you to take a breath to step in, or not just the entire time you're speaking thinking about how I'm going to respond, that's a healthy conversation. If I take a second or two to get back to you, that's a good thing. So Lisa, you did an awesome job today. I'm glad to be a part of this conversation. Can't wait to take it further.
All right. So I think I'm just gonna restate something I said earlier because I think it's important, and I think it has to do with the mindset of the speaker. When you're speaking, what is your mindset? Are you showing off? Are you checking a box? Are you actually communicating an important point? And if so, can you within your own self know what that point is? So mindset and awareness, really important. And then leading from the signal to the noise problem, I love the concept of the bluff. Well, we talked about that earlier, and this is a phrase I've been using for several years now, thanks to my friends from the military community who've taught me this word, bluff. Bottom, it's an acronym, bottom line up front. State your main point, boom. Let it sink in, and then go back and have more discussion, more clarification, and then eventually get to the readbacks and the active reflective listening. Lisa?
Great, thank you. Next, I want to go to Michelle and hear her top 3 points.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you everybody for this discussion. This discussion was actually really helpful to me and something that I'm working at EF Overwatch right now, so I'll kind of touch on that a little later. So the first point was from Chris. He spoke about the signal to noise problem and being mindful of the noise coming between us and the receiver. And so something that helps here is refining your message. And the tip that I got from that was to make sure that you can get your message across in one sentence. If you can refine your message down to one sentence, it'll facilitate the conversation and make sure that your receiver is getting your idea and what you're trying to get across. And then Lisa spoke about the feedback loop. Having someone come back and tell you what you told them is critical. And so tying back to what Chris said here, refining your message facilitates this feedback loop. If you already know and you go into a conversation with the intent of getting this one message across, it'll only facilitate the feedback loop and make sure that that message gets across. And then finally, Dan said that communication is an art and it is not formulated. You have to know what the situation dictates and what each receiver requires. And so kind of something that I got from here is just yesterday, the media team at EF Overwatch was working on refining our message for next year and identifying each of our audiences. And so something that I got really important from Lisa at the very end was that she said, everybody decodes a message differently. You have to understand your audience and know how they're going to interpret it. And so I feel like this whole conversation is going to be really helpful to us, to the media team, just analyzing our audience and making sure that we can get our message across concisely and in a really simple way so that it's easy to understand. Thank you, everybody.
Wow, that was a really good summary, Michelle, and I definitely appreciate it. I kind of want to wrap up and say and make one more comment, and that's how important this really is. I love to plug the book, Crucial Conversations, because it's something that I read, I listened to, and then I reread it. It has so many points in it, and the end state of the book is really speak so that whoever you're talking to gets it. And that's the 300 plus odd pages summed up, but it's working on communication style and speaking to be heard has really impacted my life as a leader, but also as a member of the family. I can't talk to my husband the same way as I talk to my kids, the same way as I can talk to my parents. I can't emphasize that enough. So I really appreciate everyone who joined. I appreciate the comments online. There are a few questions and comments that were online that we will hopefully address later, either via social media or maybe even another blog, which includes talking more about that feedback loop. Our next discussion is going to be on January 4th in 2021. Happy New Year, y'all. And it will be led by George Randall and Carly Walden, and it will be about exactly what Michelle was talking about, some HR topics, some hiring and strategic planning in the new year. So we'll look forward to that. And then I want to once again say thanks for joining. And if you're interested, please go to thetalentwar.com. We at the Talent War Group are available to help people out, or teams or organizations, with regards to any of the topics we've discussed here. And then finally, I'd like to say happy holidays and happy New Year. Thank you.